Johnny Carson interviewed thousands of guests during his time on The Tonight Show, and the truth is that most of them were instantly forgettable the moment the credits rolled. They came out, promoted a movie, told a safe story, laughed politely, and disappeared. So what separated the very few who weren't? Why did some guests walk through that curtain and immediately make Carson relax, knowing the night would take care of itself, while others just as famous never earned that same trust? For Johnny Carson, being a favorite guest had nothing to do with friendship, loyalty, or star power. It was about something far more practical and far more ruthless. It was about who understood live television and who didn't. Carson hated drifting segments. He hated being forced to babysit a guest through awkward beats. And more than anything, he hated moments where he had to rescue his own show because someone on the couch didn't know when to stop talking, when to land a moment, or when to hand the spotlight back to the desk. The people Carson invited back again and again weren't just funny or charming. They were reliable. They understood timing, restraint, and rhythm. They knew how to create a moment without hijacking the hour, how to be big without becoming chaos, and how to improvise without breaking the frame. That's the real difference between a good guest and a favorite one. A good guest entertains. A favorite guest makes the host feel safe. In this video, we're breaking down Johnny Carson's 15 favorite guests of all time, not through nostalgia or reputation, but through why they worked. Why Carson trusted them, why he never had to save the segment when they sat down, and why, the second they stepped onto that stage, Carson already knew the most important thing in live television. The night was under control. And when you look at Johnny Carson's list of favorite guests, one name almost feels inevitable, not because she was loud or shocking or ever tried to steal the spotlight, but because she understood something very few people ever did. Betty White didn't just know how to be funny. She knew how to be useful on live television. She knew how to make the couch feel effortless. And more importantly, she knew how to make Carson feel like he didn't have to worry. Everyone knew who Betty White was by the time she walked onto The Tonight Show. But what separated her from countless other famous faces was how instinctively she understood the rhythm of the room. Carson valued guests who could shift gears without warning, who could move from a straight interview into a bit without forcing it, without breaking the flow, and without making the host scramble to catch up. Betty could do that better than almost anyone. And the question is, was that talent, or was it decades of discipline disguised as ease? One of the reasons Carson trusted Betty so deeply was because she never needed saving. She could turn a casual exchange into a laugh without dragging the segment or overselling the joke. Even when she slipped into a sketch-like moment, it felt organic, not rehearsed, not desperate. Carson didn't have to steer her. He didn't have to rein her in. He could simply react, which is exactly where he liked to be. How many guests could be funny without demanding attention and still completely own the room? That trust became obvious in moments that would have derailed almost anyone else. During a 1978 taping, Betty casually brought an elephant onto the show without warning anyone ahead of time. On paper, that's chaos. On live television, that's a nightmare. But Carson didn't panic. He rolled with it because it was Betty White. She understood the unspoken rule: create the moment, then give control right back to the desk. And that raises a bigger question: how many performers could pull something that risky without forcing Carson to step in and take over? Betty appeared on The Tonight Show nearly 50 times, not because she was predictable, but because she was dependable. Carson hated drifting segments, and with Betty, that simply didn't happen. She knew when to talk, when to pause, and when to let silence do the work. She made the show feel lighter without making it sloppy. That's the difference between a guest who gets laughs and a guest who earns trust. Betty didn't just entertain Johnny Carson, she made his job easier. And that's why she wasn't just a good guest. She was one of his favorites. Johnny Carson had no patience for segments that drifted or jokes that needed rescuing, which is exactly why Buddy Hackett became one of his most dependable guests. Buddy didn't rely on sharp one-liners or tight setups. His strength was storytelling long, winding stories that sounded like they were about to fall apart, but never actually did. And Carson trusted him because of that. One night, Hackett launched into what seemed like a simple hunting story. A man shoots a duck, the duck lands in a farmer's yard, and suddenly there's an argument over who owns it. On its own, it's nothing special. But Buddy slowed it down. He leaned into the voices, stretched the pauses, and let the absurdity build naturally, the city guy pleads. The farmer insists, and instead of resolving it quickly, Buddy takes a sharp left turn. The farmer suggests they settle it country style. No explanation at first, just that phrase hanging in the air long enough for the audience to lean in. Then comes the rule. They take turns kicking each other in the groin. Whoever gives up loses the duck. The first kick lands, and Buddy drags the moment out mercilessly. He describes the pain. He waits. He lets Carson start laughing before the punchline even arrives. And when the city guy finally says it's his turn, the farmer calmly replies, "You can have the duck." That's when the room explodes. The brilliance wasn't the joke itself. It was how Hackett controlled the timing. Carson never interrupted. He didn't steer the story. He didn't save it. He simply watched it unfold, laughing harder as Buddy kept stretching the tension without losing the audience. That's the difference Carson cared about. Not whether a joke was neat, but whether it held. Hackett knew exactly how long he could push before delivering the payoff. That's why Buddy Hackett came back dozens of times. His stories weren't tight, but they were bulletproof. The show stayed fast, the audience stayed locked in, and Carson never had to touch the brakes. Buddy didn't just make people laugh. He made Johnny Carson feel comfortable letting the joke breathe. And that's why he wasn't just a good guest, he was one of Carson's favorites. Johnny Carson loved guests who could talk, but only if they understood how to make talking entertaining. Most guests who talked too much slowed the show down. Charles Nelson Riley did the opposite. He could turn a simple question into a full story, fill the space with personality, and somehow make the segment feel faster instead of longer. And that's a rare skill on live television. One of Riley's most replayed Tonight Show moments started with something completely ordinary. Carson asked about his mother. Riley answered honestly, saying her favorite television star wasn't Johnny Carson at all, it was Ed McMahon. On paper, that's an awkward answer. In the wrong hands, it could kill the room, but Riley leaned into it, stretching the moment just enough to let the tension bloom before Carson could react. Johnny pretended to take it personally. Riley played along. The audience felt like they were watching a real conversation teeter right on the edge of discomfort, and that's exactly why it worked. The laughter didn't come from a punchline. It came from timing and truth. Riley wasn't performing a character. He wasn't delivering a rehearsed bit. He was being himself, exaggerated just enough to stay funny. Carson trusted that authenticity. He knew Riley could keep talking without losing control of the segment because every sentence was moving toward a reaction, not away from it. How many guests can talk endlessly and still keep a host completely engaged? That's why Carson kept inviting him back. Riley never needed saving. He never drifted into rambling for its own sake. His stories always landed because he understood where the laugh lived, often in the pause, the look, or the uncomfortable honesty of the moment. Charles Nelson Riley didn't just fill airtime, he made conversation feel like entertainment. And for Johnny Carson, that made him not just a good guest, but a favorite one. With most comedians, Johnny Carson kept a careful distance. Insults could turn mean. Roasting could get personal. And one wrong beat could poison the room. But Don Rickles was different, because Rickles' entire act depended on trust. He attacked everyone in sight, but the audience always knew it was a performance, not cruelty. And Carson trusted him enough to take the hits. Rickles' jokes weren't clever puzzles or tight setups. They were blunt, rapid-fire jabs that landed because of timing and tone. He would insult Carson, Ed McMahon, the band, even the audience, but he always did it with a rhythm that made the room feel safe. Carson could lean back, let Rickles swing, and never worry the moment would turn ugly. That's a dangerous kind of comedy, and very few performers can pull it off without crossing the line. Why did Rickles get away with it? Because he always knew exactly where the line was. That trust reached its peak during one of the most famous Tonight Show moments of all time. Rickles guest hosted the show and accidentally destroyed Carson's beloved cigarette box, a prop that had sat on the desk for years. For most guests, that would have been the end of the story. Instead, Carson stormed onto the set of CPO Sharkey, where Rickles was taping. With Tonight Show cameras rolling, he interrupted the scene, scolded Rickles on camera, and turned real irritation into a perfectly controlled piece of comedy. The audience wasn't laughing because of the words. They were laughing because they knew Carson was in on it. He wasn't losing control. He was playing along. That's the level of confidence Rickles inspired. Carson trusted him enough to blur the line between real anger and performance without ever letting the show slip. How many comedians could push a host that far and still be welcomed back? Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show again and again because he delivered something Carson valued above everything else, moments people remembered and replayed. The insults never drifted, the segments never stalled, and the chaos was always carefully contained. Don Rickles didn't just roast Johnny Carson. He gave him material strong enough to last decades. And that's why Carson didn't just tolerate him. He considered him one of his favorites. Johnny Carson loved segments that felt like events, moments where the audience leaned forward because anything could happen. That's exactly why Joan Embry became one of his favorite recurring guests. When Joan walked out with an animal, the interview instantly stopped being routine. Carson didn't have to manufacture tension. The tension was already sitting on the couch. The comedy came from uncertainty. Carson never quite knew whether the animal would behave, react, or suddenly do something unpredictable. He'd lean back, squint at the creature, make nervous jokes, and let the audience feel his discomfort. That discomfort was real, and that's why it worked. Joan played the perfect counterbalance, calm, professional, and completely in control, explaining what the animal might do, while Carson reacted as if it might attack at any second. One moment could flip instantly. An animal might ignore everything, or it might lunge toward a prop Carson was holding. The laugh didn't come from a punchline. It came from the possibility that the segment could go sideways and the relief when it didn't. Carson got to be the anxious everyman, the audience's stand-in, while Joan quietly kept the chaos contained. How many segments can create tension without needing fake drama? That balance is why Carson trusted her. Joan Embry knew how far she could push the unpredictability without letting it turn into a mess. The segments never dragged, never stalled, and never became unsafe. They generated a scene every single time. Carson didn't have to steer the moment. He just reacted, which is exactly what he wanted. Joan Embry didn't just bring animals onto The Tonight Show. She brought built-in suspense, and that's why she became one of Johnny Carson's favorite guests. Johnny Carson liked guests who were talented but could still move fast on the couch, and that's exactly why Dolly Parton became a natural favorite. Dolly was playful, self-aware, and never thrown off when Carson steered the conversation into jokes or show business banter. The rhythm stayed light, and the segment never slowed down. What set her apart was control. Dolly knew how to laugh at herself without losing authority, and she always knew when to lean into a joke and when to let it go. Carson didn't have to babysit her or rescue the exchange. He could push, tease, and redirect, knowing she'd always land cleanly. She also understood something Carson valued deeply, creating moments that only worked on The Tonight Show. When Dolly performed, it didn't feel like a routine plug. It felt specific to that desk, that room, and that night. Carson could step back, let the moment breathe, then return without the energy dropping. That mix of charm, timing, and awareness is why Dolly wasn't just a good guest. She was one of Carson's favorites. Johnny Carson respected intelligence, but only when it didn't slow the show down. That's why Carl Sagan became one of his favorite serious guests. Sagan had the rare ability to explain complex ideas without sounding like a lecture. Carson could play curious, ask simple questions, and let the conversation flow without the energy dropping. What made Sagan work was balance. He was confident but never chaotic, knowledgeable but never condescending. He knew when to simplify, when to pause, and when to slip in a light smile or a quick joke. The audience didn't feel like they were being taught. They felt like they were being invited in. Carson genuinely seemed fascinated by Sagan, and that mattered. The segments never dragged because Sagan understood he was on an entertainment show, not in a classroom. He delivered substance without stiffness, and that's why he wasn't just an informative guest. He was one Carson actually enjoyed having back. Johnny Carson had very little interest in sports interviews that turned into statistics, scores, or stiff promotion. What he loved were guests who could make the couch feel loose and funny, even if the audience didn't care about the subject at all. That's exactly why Bob Uecker became one of his favorite recurring guests. Uecker wasn't brought on to explain baseball. He was brought on because he understood comedy. Instead of bragging about accomplishments, Uecker built his entire Tonight Show persona around failure. He talked about striking out constantly, sitting on the bench, and being so bad at the game that surviving a season felt like an achievement. The jokes landed because they were honest, fast, and completely self-aware. You didn't need to know a single baseball stat to get the laugh. Carson loved that. It meant the segment worked for everyone watching at home, not just sports fans. What really made Uecker special was his pacing. His stories came in clean beats, each one setting up the next laugh without dragging the segment down. Carson often laughed so hard, he struggled to ask the next question, but the show never lost momentum. Uecker didn't ramble. He didn't oversell. He knew exactly when to stop and let the laugh breathe before moving on. That kind of instinct is rare, and Carson noticed it immediately. There was also no bitterness in Uecker's comedy. He never sounded resentful about his mediocre playing career. He embraced it and turned it into his entire brand. That humility made him relatable, and it made the humor feel effortless instead of defensive. Carson appreciated guests who didn't take themselves too seriously, because they were the easiest to trust on live television. Bob Uecker appeared on The Tonight Show again and again because he never needed rescuing. The pace stayed quick, the laughs stayed steady, and the couch always felt under control. He didn't just talk about baseball, he used it as raw material for comedy. And that's why, to Johnny Carson, Bob Uecker wasn't just a sports guest, he was a favorite. Johnny Carson valued guests who made the couch feel effortless, and that's exactly where Angie Dickinson fit in. Her appearances never felt tense or forced. From the moment she sat down, the rhythm settled into something smooth and relaxed, the kind of segment Carson loved because it required almost no maintenance. The conversation flowed naturally, without awkward pauses or moments that needed steering. What made Dickinson stand out was balance. She was glamorous without being stiff and playful without losing control. The flirtation between her and Carson was always present, but it never crossed into discomfort or distraction. It felt like two professionals who understood the rules of live television and trusted each other to stay inside them. Carson could lean into the charm, knowing it would never go sideways. Dickinson also understood timing in a way many guests didn't. She knew when to answer directly and when to let a moment breathe. She didn't rush to fill silence, and she didn't over-explain stories. That restraint made the segment feel confident rather than crowded. Carson hated interviews that felt strained or overworked, and with Dickinson, that risk simply didn't exist. There was also a sense of old Hollywood polish that Carson genuinely admired. Dickinson had years of experience in front of cameras, and it showed. She understood pacing, tone, and how small reactions could carry as much weight as big laughs. The result was an interview that felt calm, controlled, and quietly entertaining rather than loud or chaotic. That's why Carson kept inviting her back. Angie Dickinson didn't need rescuing. She didn't slow the show down. She made the hour smoother just by being there. And on live television, that kind of reliability is rare. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't unpredictable. She was something Carson valued just as much dependable. And that's why she earned her place among his favorite guests. Tonight Show audiences loved moments that felt unplanned, and few appearances captured that better than Drew Barrymore when she first came on the show as a child. The moment she ran out onto the stage, the tone instantly changed. She didn't walk. She charged. She talked fast, moved constantly, and treated the couch like it belonged to her. Carson wasn't leading the interview anymore, he was reacting to it. The comedy came from contrast. Drew was tiny, confident, and completely unfiltered. She interrupted Carson, told stories without waiting for questions, and bounced between topics with zero hesitation. Most child guests were either shy or over-rehearsed. Drew was neither. She had no fear of the cameras and no sense of television rules, which made every second unpredictable. Carson didn't try to rein her in. He let it happen. That's what made the moment work. Carson understood that the best thing he could do was stay calm and let the chaos play out. He became the straight man, grounding the segment while Drew turned the couch into her personal playground. The laughs didn't come from punchlines. They came from watching a seasoned host adapt in real time to a tiny whirlwind of energy. It's also why the appearance became legendary. Drew wasn't performing a bit, she was being herself. The audience could feel that authenticity immediately, and Carson seemed genuinely charmed by it. That reaction was rare for him. He usually kept professional distance, but here, he simply enjoyed the moment. Carson valued guests who could create something memorable without planning it, and even as a child, Drew Barrymore did exactly that. She didn't need structure. She created the scene on her own, and Carson trusted her enough to let the moment breathe. That's why her first Tonight Show appearance is still talked about decades later, not because it was polished, but because it was real. Johnny Carson admired many performers, but very few earned his genuine reverence. Jack Benny was one of them. When Benny sat down on The Tonight Show, the tone subtly shifted. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It felt like a masterclass in comedy precision unfolding in real time. What Carson respected most about Jack Benny was restraint. Benny didn't chase laughs. He waited for them. His comedy lived in pauses, in silence stretched just long enough to make the audience uncomfortable, and then released with perfect timing. A raised eyebrow, a delayed response, or a single deadpan line could generate bigger laughs than pages of dialogue. Carson understood exactly what he was watching, someone who knew that the smallest moment, handled correctly, could be the punchline. During Benny's appearances, Carson instinctively stepped back. He didn't rush to fill gaps or steer the conversation aggressively. He let Benny control the rhythm, knowing the payoff was coming. The audience leaned in, not because something loud or chaotic was happening, but because the silence itself became suspense. That kind of confidence is rare, especially on live television, where most performers panic at the idea of dead air. Benny represented everything Carson believed about comedy: precision over noise, timing over volume, control over chaos. Carson openly studied Benny's technique, and it influenced his own hosting style for decades. The way Carson learned to let silence do the work, to trust the pause instead of rushing to the next line, came directly from watching Jack Benny. That's why Benny never felt like just another guest. He felt like a benchmark. When Jack Benny appeared on the show, it wasn't about promotion or plugging a project. It was about watching a craftsman at work. Carson treated him with visible respect, and Benny returned it by delivering performances that were effortlessly funny and technically flawless. Those segments didn't just entertain, they quietly defined what great television comedy was supposed to look like. By the time Steve Martin became a regular on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson was no longer just booking a guest. He was signaling trust. Carson used Martin in bigger ways than most comedians, and that mattered. It meant Martin wasn't there to test material lightly, he was there to deliver. What made Steve Martin work so perfectly on Carson's stage was control disguised as absurdity. The bits were strange, fast, and visually memorable: an arrow through the head, balloon animals, exaggerated gestures, but they were never chaotic. Martin knew exactly when to hit a beat, when to pause, and when to hand the moment back to Carson. The laughter came quickly, but the pacing stayed tight. Carson loved comedians who could be big without taking over the show, and Martin understood that balance instinctively. Carson also trusted Martin with something rare: debuting material. New bits are dangerous on live television. If they fail, the host has to rescue the segment. But Martin delivered clean, repeatable set pieces that landed immediately. Carson could lean back, watch the audience react, and know the risk was already under control. That level of confidence doesn't come from hype, it comes from consistency. What truly elevated Martin into favorite status was his awareness of the desk. After every laugh, he reset. He never lingered too long. He let Carson re-enter the conversation smoothly, keeping the hour moving forward. The show never felt hijacked. It felt sharpened. Steve Martin represented the next generation of comedy, but he respected The Tonight Show's structure. He brought innovation without disrespecting the format. Carson saw that immediately. That's why Martin wasn't just a frequent guest. He was someone Carson trusted to carry the moment and then give it right back. Johnny Carson loved guests who arrived with ammunition characters, impressions, and a willingness to perform as long as they understood the line between fun and chaos. That's exactly where Martin Short thrived. When Short sat down, the interview didn't stay an interview for long. It shifted into performance, and Carson welcomed that shift because he could still steer it. Short's comedy worked because it was big without being reckless. He could explode into a character mid-sentence, transform the tone of the segment instantly, and still remain aware of the desk. The audience never knew what was coming next, but Carson always did. That balance is rare. Most high-energy guests force the host to chase them. Short let Carson guide the chaos instead of fighting it. The laughs came from surprise and commitment. Short didn't tease a character, he became it fully, with voice, posture, and exaggerated emotion. The couch turned into a stage, and Carson got to play the straight man, reacting in real time as the bit unfolded. If something wasn't landing, Short pivoted instantly, slipping back into conversation without making it awkward. That professional instinct is what Carson valued most. What made Short a favorite wasn't just the characters, it was discipline. He knew when to go big and when to pull back. He never lingered too long inside a bit, and he always handed the moment back cleanly. The segment stayed fast, alive, and under control. Carson didn't need to babysit him. He could enjoy the ride. Martin Short turned interviews into events without derailing the hour. He gave Carson moments to react to, not problems to fix. And on live television, that difference is everything. That's why Short wasn't just a funny guest. He was a reliable one and one of Carson's favorites. Johnny Carson believed that stand-up on The Tonight Show was a test. If it landed, a comedian didn't just get laughs, they got momentum. That's why Jim Carrey made such an immediate impression. From the moment Carrey stepped on stage, it was obvious this wasn't a standard set built on punchlines alone. It was performance. Carrey didn't rely on topical jokes or clever wordplay. He used his body like an instrument. His face stretched, snapped, and transformed mid-sentence. Impressions flowed into exaggerated expressions so quickly that the audience barely had time to process one before the next arrived. The laughs didn't come from understanding a joke, they came from watching something happen in real time. Even if you missed a line, the comedy still landed. Carson watched him closely. What made the moment special wasn't just the energy, but the control inside it. Carrey's act was chaotic on the surface, yet carefully paced underneath. He knew when to speed up, when to pause, and when to let the audience catch up. Too much physical comedy can exhaust a room. Too little becomes a novelty. Carrey hit the balance perfectly. The audience realized they were seeing something new. This wasn't a variation on an existing style. It felt like a different species of comedian altogether. Carson treated the moment seriously because he understood the significance. He wasn't just hosting a set, he was witnessing a breakout. That's why the performance stayed memorable decades later. It didn't depend on references or context. It was pure visual comedy, built to survive time. Jim Carrey didn't just pass Carson's test, he redefined what that test could look like. And for Johnny Carson, recognizing that kind of raw, undeniable talent is exactly why certain guests become favorites. If there was one kind of guest Johnny Carson trusted almost more than comedians, it was the performer who never made the night harder. And no one embodied that better than Marilyn May. In a show filled with egos, surprises, and last-minute risks, May was the definition of reliability. Musical guests are always a gamble on late-night television. They can stop the momentum, drain the energy, or feel like an obligation instead of an event. Marilyn May did the opposite. When she performed, the studio went quiet not because the energy dropped, but because the audience leaned in. Carson could step back, watch the room change, and return to the desk with that familiar look of appreciation, knowing he'd just witnessed something precise and controlled. What Carson valued most about Mae was professionalism. She hit her marks. She respected the clock. She understood the structure of the show and never disrupted it. Her performances didn't feel like promotional stops. They felt like the centerpiece of the night. That kind of consistency is rare, especially for a musical guest, and Carson rewarded it. Marilyn Mae appeared on The Tonight Show more than 70 times, an astonishing number that speaks volumes. That wasn't nostalgia. That was trust. Carson could book her without worry, knowing the segment would work, the audience would respond, and nothing would need rescuing afterward. She also shared Carson's love for classic show business craftsmanship. Clear vocals, clean presentation, and emotional control. No excess, no chaos, just execution. In a medium where live mistakes can derail an entire hour, Mae made everything feel effortless. That's why Marilyn Mae wasn't just a frequent guest. She was a safety net. She made the entire machine run smoother simply by being there. And for Johnny Carson, that level of trust was priceless. That's what earned her a permanent place among his favorite guests. When you step back and look at Johnny Carson's favorite guests as a group, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. They weren't chosen because they were the biggest stars, the loudest personalities, or the most talked about names of their era. They were chosen because they understood the job. They knew how to work, live television without making it fragile. Carson didn't reward chaos unless it was controlled. He didn't reward charm unless it came with timing. And he didn't reward talent unless it made the show easier, not harder. Every guest on this list did something very specific. They created moments without forcing Carson to rescue them. They knew when to take space and when to give it back. They respected the desk, the clock, and the rhythm of the hour. That's why these appearances still hold up decades later. They aren't remembered for shock value or nostalgia alone. They're remembered because they worked. The segments moved. The audience stayed engaged. And Carson stayed in control exactly where he wanted to be. Being a favorite guest on The Tonight Show wasn't about being loved. It was about being trusted. And trust, in live television, is earned one moment at a time. So the next time you watch a classic Carson clip, look past the laughs, watch the timing, watch the pauses, watch how little he has to intervene. That's where you'll see why these guests mattered and why Johnny Carson kept them close.